I was pleased to see that SETHA at least was one academic introducing their talks with books, or at least advertising books. This is unashamed advertising, and what I'm going to talk about is partly from this book, but it's partly from some other sort of thinking that I've done. So as usual, like Vikas, Tigran calls you up once a year with a plane ticket, always economy, and he tells you what you're going to talk about. So you told me it was complete streets, who gets to choose, or something. So really what I'm going to do is try and problematize this idea of complete streets, and I'm going to explain what complete streets are. But several of you have touched on this idea of making public spaces in somebody's ideal, and in many ways in the US, the complete streets movement is a way of making streets supposedly more sustainable, but also complete streets generally happen in white neighborhoods. They have effects on gentrification and displacement. So I really want to unpack a little bit of that. And if anybody tweets or if anybody wants to say any comments, then my hashtag is Just Sustainabilities and my handle is Julian Agyeman. So let me just start, though, with the platform for all of my work is this concept of just sustainabilities, which I think fills what I call the equity deficit. Back in 2000, myself, Bob Bullard, Bob Evans in the UK, were starting to look at the sustainability discourse and realizing it was almost entirely an environmental and environmentalist discourse. 16 years ago now, we published this book, Just Sustainability's Development in an Unequal World, which really focused explicitly, not implicitly, but explicitly on equity and justice, on the links between environmental quality and human equality. Prior to that, environmental quality was Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. Human equality was Amnesty International. These organizations, social justice, environmental quality, were not talking to each other. They weren't working together. So you had strange things like, for instance, those of you who are old enough to remember, 1988, Chico Mendes was killed in the Amazon rainforest. And a few years later, Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed in the Niger Delta. Very similar. But the environmentalists said Ken Saro-Wiwa was a green campaigner. No, he wasn't. He was a trade union organizer. He was the head of the Brazilian Rubber Tappers Union. But he got the picture. He understood that environmental quality was absolutely fundamental to the livelihoods of his workers. To claim that he was a green was not true. He was both. He was, like Ken Saro-Wiwa, into social justice and environmental quality. In the North, we tend to be rather reductionist, and we separate out these social movements, these activisms. But global Southern campaigners like Ken Saro-Wiwa in the Niger Delta and like Chico Mendes really understood this link between environmental quality and human equality. So really, we were arguing that sustainability, though green was important, it wasn't the whole picture, that there was an equity deficit, and we needed to fill that by realizing that we needed wider questions of social needs and welfare, economic opportunity, which are integrally related to living in one planet ecosystems, if you like, or to living one planet lives. So just sustainability was really born out of this idea that we need to think about a broader set of questions. And of course, if we went onto the streets of Reykjavik right now and said to people, what does sustainability mean? 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 would say it's about the environment. But the way I look at it, it's about the environment and a lot more. So we came up with a definition, the need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And there are 4 conditions there. There must be a commitment to improvement of the quality of life and well-being. Not just lifestyles of the rich and famous, but the livelihoods of the poorest people. Meeting the needs of both present and future generations. Most sustainability literature still talks about future generations, forgetting social justice now. We need to think about justice and equity in terms, and I'm really pleased to see SETHA using this concept of recognition. Black Lives Matter, Me Too. This new cry for recognition, before which any form of justice is irrelevant, if we don't recognize people's right to justice. So recognition comes before reconciliation of First Peoples, Aboriginal peoples, etc. So equity and justice in terms of recognition, process, procedure, and outcome. And then living within ecosystem limits, one planet living. So that's what just sustainability is. It does not negate the very real environmental crisis that we're in. It simply says there are other issues that actually are causing this crisis. These environmental crises are not caused by environmental issues, because environmental issues are human-caused issues. Before I start as well, I want to give you two thoughts as an urban planner, two overarching thoughts. And one is in reference to ALEAG's emeritus colleague, Patsy Healy from Newcastle. I love her definition of urban planning as managing our coexistence in shared space. Coexistence, shared space. Two very, that's what we do as urban planners. I'd like to say we celebrate our coexistence, but I'll take managing for now. Manage our coexistence in shared space. And this is really important, especially as we live in more diverse cities, and the environmental, transport, and other conflicts in cities are not taking place in a city of one public. They're taking place in multiple publics, as Ali said. We are living in cities of diversity and difference. How do we as urban planners, how do we as sustainability specialists, how do we as futurists think about managing coexistence in shared space in cities of increasing diversity and difference? It would be easy if everybody ate alike, prayed alike, fucked alike, did everything the same, but it's not the case. We don't do that. We as humans are increasingly diverse and different, and that's what makes cities exciting. But it makes them a challenge as well, thinking about urban planning. And then my other big set of thoughts, and I'll come to this more in my talk, what's the relationship between belonging and becoming in the city? We as urban planners, we as futurists, we as thinkers are very good about what cities can become. Smart cities, sharing cities, resilient cities, sustainable cities, walkable cities, cyclable cities. We're not very good at the corollary, which is belonging. Recognition, reconciliation, difference, diversity and inclusion. And I think we need to balance these two. Otherwise, we're going to have cities becoming what we elites want them to become, because we're denying increasing numbers the right to belong in cities. And I'll come back to this. So I think my idea of just sustainability is really appeals to both this belonging and becoming nature of cities. And I like to talk as well about humane-scaled urban planning as opposed to just human-scaled. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, and it'll become obvious why I want us to think about humane-scaled as opposed to solely human-scale planning. But I want to start off with a concept that I focus on a lot in my work, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, and again, I talked to Ali about this idea of spatial justice. David Lammy, the British Member of Parliament, I think described it very well and very simply. Just as social justice requires that life chances are not distributed along class lines, spatial justice requires that they are not distributed geographically. We have cities like this around the world. We have cities with walls that separate. Belfast used to be like that, Nicosia, Jerusalem. But if I was doing this in a US audience, I would say this. I would say, but how many of you grew up in a city where there was a railway line, a creek, a river, a freeway, or some other geographical feature, and on one side they lived, and on the other side you lived? So the Americans in the audience, put your hands up if you lived you grew up in a town like that. Okay, literally all the Americans in the audience grew up in a town where they were, Don, what was it in your town?
It was actually on a larger spatial scale. We were just walled off by hills.
Okay, right. So natural geographic features. But this is the reality. Spatial injustice is the reality. Spatial segregation is the reality for most Americans. But my friend asked me to talk about complete streets, so let's bring it down to the streets. Spatial justice and streets. Many of you have seen this slide before. On the right is Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, that's Harvard Law School just being built, where the crane is. On the left is Södervägen in Gothenburg. Streets are exactly the same width, but the spatial organization of the streets could not be different. In the United States, there is one principle about your rights of access to public space: size. Size matters. The bigger your vehicle, the more rights you have. So the biggest right to space is the MBTA buses, and then you've got the FedEx van, and that's how it's organized. The Swedes have said, hey, let's have a more spatially just street. Let's allocate more rights to pedestrians, to cyclists, to public transit users. And to the left of the tram is the only part of the street where private vehicles can go. The Swedes have democratized the street, and the doubly depressing thing is, this is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, one of the most liberal, progressive cities in the United States. Now, it has changed a little bit in that there are bike lanes, but these are just painted, actually, on the left-hand side now, they're actually divided lanes. So things are getting better, but my point here is, you're a kid growing up. How are you wired differently living on one of two of these streets? What does the kid coming out onto Södervägen think about, and what does the kid coming out onto Massachusetts Avenue think about every day? Because as several of you have said, the street is our most important public space. Every day you interact with streets. It must be very, very different. Now we have the data. We have done Appleyard's work on car traffic decreasing social interaction. The lighter the traffic, the more social interaction, the more friendships formed on the street. So what's the just sustainability's implication of this? Where are most of the heavily trafficked streets in US cities? They're in lower income neighborhoods. So we can see that car traffic, social interaction, the legacy of racist town planning practices has led to a legacy really where streetscapes, and I can think of them in Boston, that are deeply spatially segregated because things like traffic calming haven't really happened. They've happened in higher income neighborhoods where there is much lighter traffic. But we are starting to think differently in the US. This is Times Square, and just outside of Macy's, things are changing. I would never have thought in my life that I would see the car is king mentality challenged in such a way as it's being. And in many ways, it was Bloomberg who hired Janet Sadiq Khan, a brilliant transportation commissioner, who brought in Jan Gehl from Copenhagen, and then they unleashed the energy of the alternative transportation justice, civil society groups in New York. And you really had a policy and planning coalition that made this happen. And I want you to remember here, planning, sustainability shouldn't be about what is possible. It shouldn't be about what is probable. It must be about what is possible. The High Line doesn't happen. This doesn't happen. The great things that we can do as urban planners and sustainability advocates don't happen if we think about what is probably going to happen. We've got to think about what is possible. But, talking of belonging, we're much better actually at spatial injustice. We're very good at hostile and defensive architecture. We're very good at inhumane planning. Top left, we have the anti-skateboard ridges or bolts put onto walls. In the center top, we have the armrests put in to stop homeless people sleeping. We have the bolts that are built in to stop homeless people. I mean, we do that to stop pigeons, and now we're doing it to stop human beings sleeping. It is inhumane, and I'd call on architects and planners not to participate in this kind of planning. Bottom left, very cynical. I'll give a copy of this book to anybody that knows what's going on the bottom left. Bottom left, I need the city, I need the date, Seth, I need everything. What's going on there? Okay, so I'll tell you what, it's in Seattle. Homeless people sleeping under the bridge, so the city said, hey, we've got the answer. bike racks. We'll deter them with bike racks. How cynical, what a cynical use of sustainability infrastructure to use bike racks. Now, we like bike racks, they're good. And kudos to the Seattle cycling community. They said, this is disgusting, we have a problem with homelessness, we all need to accept that, but we need policy solutions, not using our infrastructure as hostile architecture to stop homeless people. We're going to see more and more of this, of cities doing battle, and I think Don's talking about this as well, cities doing battle, using sustainability as the sword and the shield, if you like, to push away so-called homeless or unhoused people. And of course the classic as well is the rich door, poor doors. Many cities now are, going for big development, but they want a certain amount of affordable or social housing. Poor doors around the back, rich doors on the boulevards. Before I go on to talk about complete streets, I just want to give it the strange case of LA. Would you believe LA, the car capital, has a complete streets policy? And I'll go on to describe these, but what's really interesting is, as we know, LA has a huge Latino, South Asian population. One of the cultural features of those populations is street food, street vending, and it's actually illegal in LA. So again, this grotesque idea that you can have complete streets while denying the cultural rights of South Asians and Latinos to be street vendors seems really strange. They've changed it. They changed it from last October, but not for the right reason, not because they see the cultural right to do this. They changed it because of the election of President Trump and ICE enforcement. And if ICE officers know that these are people doing an illegal activity, then they can round them up much more easily than if they are permitted street vendors. So again, complete streets, it cannot be simply a design solution, it has to be a social and cultural concept as well. And I think LA is slowly beginning to understand that. So let's just talk a little bit then about this complete streets idea. So it has taken off in the US by storm. It's called different things in different parts of the world, but complete streets basically is this idea here, the strip gardens, seating areas. Complete streets are sometimes called sticky streets, places where people want to stick around and talk. Concept was introduced in 2003 by a cycling group called America Bikes. We now have a national complete streets coalition, and it's really changing the paradigm. The paradigm in the US was that street engineering was about moving the motorist as quickly as possible from A to B without distraction. That's why we have so many grids and straight streets. It's about moving the motorist. But in a sense, changing that paradigm was tough. And so the National Complete Streets Coalition, which includes planning and architecture associations, the AARP, the American Association of Retired People, who are the most annoying organization in the United States, because as soon as you touch 50, it doesn't matter if you're retired or not, you start getting letters from them, they find out who you are. I might get them in about 5 or 10 years' time, who knows. But the American Heart Association, so this is a big coalition of interested parties. What they've recently found out is, lo and behold, most of the awards for the most complete streets in America have gone to largely white middle-class neighborhoods. So they've introduced now a criterion, or a set of criteria, to look at equity in complete streets. And again, I'll come back to that. On the right is a typical street design manual, and you can see them there, street design manuals, very much aimed at the urban designer, very much aimed at intervention through design. Complete Streets is also a social movement. It's not simply a professional movement, it's a social movement. In Boston, we've got livable streets, reclaim the streets. Every city in the US has its social movement organizations who participate in one of these two models, the policy model, but more often the cultural model. Policy model says quantitative studies which are used to justify bike legislation, leading to street redesign, expected to change behavior, making better streets. culture model, slightly different, but the aims are the same, and there's a mixture of these two. So Complete Streets is both a professional approach and it is a social movement within the United States. Is it a solution to spatial injustice, the spatial injustice that I've talked about on streets? Well, here's some examples from Massachusetts, Swampscott, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, Somerville, which is where Tufts University is, City of Toronto on the right. Can this, so the question we ask in the book, can this Complete Streets discourse, its design manuals, its policies, the regulatory structures, can it reverse the inequalities that car-centric planning has wrought on US urban planning, or will it result in increased livability chances for the most privileged residents? One of the things that I really learned from Vikas, who wrote a chapter in the book, was streets as social constructs. Streets are not simply physical spaces. And I invoke the work here of the late great geographer Doreen Massey, who talks about places, and I see streets as places, that are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. Streets are ecologies, I think, as Vikas called them. Streets are the bundles of social relations that change through time. Yes, they are physical spaces, but I contrast here, the urban designer approach and the more organic approach of a street in Athens that's just become really a kind of a social ecology. The Complete Streets rhetoric, we argue in the book, disconnects streets from their significant social, structural, symbolic, discursive, and historical realities. How do we get urban designers to think differently about streets as people spaces and not just as places amenable to the designer's pen or AutoCAD or whatever they use these days? Another big issue that we have with this idea of complete streets is the concept of greenlining. A little bit of a plug here. So I co-edit a series for Routledge called Equity, Justice, and the Sustainable City. And these are 3 of the books that are really relevant to the idea of gentrification. There's Just Green Enough, Curran and Hamilton's book. There's Ken Gould and Tammy Lewis's Green Gentrification, and Susanna Bunce from Toronto's Sustainability Policy and Planning and Gentrification in Cities. There's a lot of really good work going on this, talking about this idea of greenlining. Setha came out with a really interesting point, laissez-faire racism. So let's think about greenlining. Seriously, it's a great point. Most of you know, certainly the US people, but for those of you who don't, we've had a crisis in US cities through what was called redlining, the differential funding of neighborhoods based on race. And literally a red line was a realtor and loan specialist's pen put onto a map to say, okay, these neighborhoods don't get any funding, these neighborhoods do. We have zoning issues that have been used to exclude certain people. So redlining, yellow lining, segregationist ideas were explicitly racist. Greenlining is not explicitly racist. Greenlining is where these modifications to streets happen in certain neighborhoods, in certain places, and the people who can afford to buy and rent in those neighborhoods all seem to look the same. Not explicitly racist, but I think the laissez-faire racism idea that Setha came, that's exactly what greenlining is. It's the use of sustainability, and who doesn't want sustainable neighborhoods? It's the use of sustainability to do something that is ostensibly good, green, trees, slow people down, mocha lattes, boys who speak with French accents, with long ponytails, white guys with dreadlocks. Who doesn't want that? That's what. You don't want that. That's what greenlining does. Okay. And the story behind greenlining, of course, is one of gentrification. Now, let's just go a little bit further on this. Ground zero of gentrification in many ways is Portland, Oregon. That's where the boys and girls who look like I've just described are all heading. They're heading to Portland, Oregon, and they're heading to Asheville, North Carolina. In one street, North Williams Avenue, is a microcosm of this complete streets clash, and the clash of what I call heritage narratives. So on the one hand, this was a black neighborhood in Portland. This was part of the Albina neighborhood. This was part of a black neighborhood in Portland. And I want to read the quote from a resident when a proposal was put in to put bike lanes on North Williams, which went right through this previously African-American neighborhood. She said, what's causing the anger and the resentment is that it's only an issue of safety now that whites are the ones who are riding bicycles and walking on the streets. We've been in this community for years, and it's not been an issue now, and now it's an issue. So that's the resentment you're hearing. Years of people being told, you don't count, you don't matter, lack of recognition. But now there's a group of people who's coming in that look like the people who are the power brokers downtown. Now it's important, that's the anger, that's the hurt. So Donna Maxey was president of the Residents Association, an African-American woman with a very long heritage in the area. This is a microcosm, yes, we want people cycling, but is cycling and cycleways, are they harbingers of gentrification, or has actually gentrification started a long time before the cycle lanes come in? So again, North Williams now, this scheme was enacted about 3 or 4 years ago. They undertook some restorative justice work. It was always going to happen, but the restorative justice work was done, I think, by the city council just because they wanted some of the new incomers to be able to talk to and understand the fears and complaints of some of the original residents. One of the icons of complete streets is the notion of walkability. Cyclability. Walk score is a measurement of walkability. And again, we want walkable streets, but we want them in every neighborhood. Walk score is part of Redfin. What is Redfin? Americans, tell the rest of the people, what is Redfin? Realtor. One of the biggest realtor estate agents in the United States is Redfin, and it owns Walk Score. Let's just stop here. We have totally commoditized sustainability when a realtor owns the app that measures walkability, sustainability's most treasured urban feature. We have commoditized sustainability. This is the way it works, especially in the United States. We can have sustainable neighborhoods, but you're going to pay for them. I want complete streets in every neighborhood, especially those neighborhoods that have been most deprived. Those are the ones that need it most. And so this is the web page for Walk Score, and you can see how they're using the High Line here. Great places, improve your commute, fits your lifestyle. Yesterday I tweeted about these new neighborhood apps. You know what these new neighborhood apps are? They're about crime. But they're not about real measurable crime statistics. They're about what your neighbors think you're going to do. And if you don't look like them, they're much more likely to be reporting you. So this whole app-based approach to complete streets, to neighborhood livability, sustainability, I think we have to be very, very skeptical about how it's being done. So coming back to, in a sense, Tigran's challenge, complete streets, who belongs, I really think we need to think about that. Who belongs? Who can belong in these complete streets? And one of the quotes that we sort of close up the book is, these physical changes can make certain street users and the dwellers in some neighborhoods invisible, further diminishing their rights and roles in the community. In these predominantly low-income communities and neighborhoods of color, people worry that such changes will foster gentrification. It's already happening, and complete streets might seem benign. It might seem like a nice sustainability solution to urban decay, if you like. It's not as benign as you think. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of the city managers, a lot of the mayors that are implementing these huge complete street schemes know in the back of their minds that they're going to get higher property taxes, that the developers are going to get higher rentals. So when you see complete streets, think of it as a double-edged sword. Thank you.